keep pilots and qualified maintenance personnel at all levels. The competition for talent is fierce. The qualified pool is dwindling, and the bars to service seem to be increasing. The culture of the generation the services are attempting to recruit and retain has also changed. They think differently, they communicate differently, and define what they value differently than the generation of current leaders, and certainly of those that develop the policies used today. These are complex, hard problems, and we're not going to solve them today. But what we can do is get smarter about how we think about solving them. Our witnesses are personnel experts, and they are also expert in conceptualizing our approach to personnel problems. They can help us find new ways to collect and use data to make personnel decisions, suggest novel approaches for evaluating program efficacy, and think creatively. We have a responsibility to take these problems seriously and not chalk up shortcomings to the inscrutable lifestyles and preferences of, quote, the kids these days, unquote. Leadership means listening to and learning from those we serve. And the great benefit of living in the 21st century is that even when the people we wish we could talk to are too busy texting on their cell phones and playing, I don't even know if Candy Crush is popular today, we can collect data on them and just learn in the aggregate. I believe the services need to think creatively and beyond their current cultures about how to manage people. The central question for you today is, how can we create a 21st century service personnel set of policies that are appropriately managed and sufficiently flexible in order to recruit, retain, and compensate the right mix of talented service members throughout their career to sustain the all-volunteer force? I'm interested to hear from our witnesses their views on what the future requirements are for effective military personnel policies and what effect these policies may have on the all-volunteer force. But before doing so, I'd like to offer Ranking Member Kelly an opportunity to make his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I wish to welcome our witnesses to today's hearing. There can be no doubt that the United States military is the greatest in the world and that the key to our success is the people. Less than 1% of U.S. citizens volunteer to serve in the military, and the officers, warrant officers, and enlisted members who make up our current force are among the highest quality that we've ever had. Nonetheless, there are signs of stress within our force. The Army will again this year miss its recruiting goals, while the Air Force continues to experience a critical pilot shortage. Similarly, many of the reserve components continue to struggle to meet their in-strength missions. It is clear that there are many issues contributing to the problem, including a strong economy, record low unemployment, and a low propensity to serve among today's youth. In that light, I want to thank the Chairwoman for holding today's important hearing on military personnel policy. The Defense Officer Personnel Management Act, DOPMA, and the Reserve Officer Personnel Management Act, ROPMA, represent the statutory foundation for officer accession, promotion, and separation. DOPMA and ROPMA have served us well for over 40 years, and the fundamentals of the up-and-out system are integral to maintaining a talented and dynamic force. Before making additional changes to personnel management, we need to clearly understand what the problem is. Specifically, we need to understand why officers are electing to get out of the military and what would have kept them in the service. The Defense Department already has much of the data necessary to answer these questions, but my perception is they are not leveraging this information in order to make informed decisions. It's amazing with all the inline and online information that we have today, they can tell you what your shopping preferences at Walmart are, but we can't tell why soldiers are getting out of the military. While Congress has made several changes in the last few years related to DOPMA, I'm interested to hear from our panel about how to improve reserve officer management. Particularly, I look forward to hearing how we can improve permeability between the active and reserve components and enhance the quality of life and predictability for the total force. I'm also interested to hear from the witnesses how we can improve recruiting and retention to the Warrant Officer Corps. These professionals provide needed experience and technical expertise that is integral to military readiness, and I would like to hear how we can best incentivize them to stay until retirement. Finally, I'm interested to hear from our witnesses about preserving adequate compensation for our service members. While increased compensation is not going to solve all our recruiting and retention problems, it is an integral incentive. It is important to note that 71% of young Americans between the ages of 17 and 24 are not physically or mentally able to serve. That means the military service in many cases are competing head-to-head with civilian industries for the same 29 out of every 100 students who are eligible to serve, a very small and ever-shrinking pool. In short, the services must remain competitive and ensure that our service members continue to receive the pay and benefits they so richly deserve. With that, Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. We're now going to hear from our witnesses, and each member will have the opportunity to question the witnesses for 5 minutes. And we ask the witnesses to try and limit their comments to 5 minutes. I know that's going to be tough, so we'll give you a little latitude. Let's start with Dr. Beth Ashe, who's the senior economist at the RAND Corporation. Welcome.
Thank you. Chairwoman Spear, Ranking Member Kelly, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to testify today. Recently, Congress and the services introduced measures to increase the flexibility of military personnel management to better reward performance and to meet emerging requirements in fields such as cyber. But any effort to improve retention, performance, and talent management should also consider how the current military compensation system might need to change, since military compensation is also a critical strategic human resource tool. My comments today focus on this topic, and the main conclusion is that research points to several areas for possible improvement in the compensation system, and I expand on this in my written testimony. The first concerns the setting of the level of military pay. Specifically, it should be ascertained whether the appropriate benchmark for setting military pay is above the 70th percentile of civilian pay for individuals with similar characteristics. Since the early 2000s, the 70th percentile has been the guiding factor in setting military pay. In ascertaining whether the appropriate benchmark now exceeds the 70th percentile, it's important for the services to identify the qualifications and the quality of the force that's required and whether military pay is the most cost-effective means of achieving that force compared with other policies that might be used. The second area for improvement is the annual pay adjustment mechanism, which determines the annual percentage increase in basic pay. The annual adjustment is based on the Employment Cost Index, or ECI. Unfortunately, the ECI does not seem to accurately track the opportunity wages relevant to military personnel. In particular, measuring the pay gap using the ECI did not perform well historically in terms of tracking outcomes like recruiting and retention. The implication is that the functioning of the ECI needs to be reevaluated and alternative approaches for setting the annual pay increase should be assessed. This is important because poor functioning of the pay adjustment mechanism should be minimized, especially given the growth in military personnel costs. The third area for possible improvement is the structure of the military pay table. In particular, the structure of the officer pay table might need to be adjusted to embed stronger incentives for performance. A first look at the structure of the officer pay table suggests that pay in the upper ranks may be overly compressed and may not provide adequate retention and performance incentives over a career. Related to this, some use of performance-based longevity pay increases should be explored. Today, intra-grade performance incentives are weakened by the lockstep nature of longevity increases in the current pay table. One potential way to embed performance incentives is the use of a time and grade pay table or appropriately structured constructive credit within the current time and service pay table. The fourth area is the setting of special and incentive pays, or so-called S&I pays. The roughly 60 different S&I pays are intended to be a source of flexibility and efficiency. S&I pay might be improved in 3 ways. First, research has argued that S&I pay should comprise a larger share of cash compensation to improve pay flexibility and efficiency. Second, Some S&I pays could be set to better sustain and reward performance. And third, S&I pays that are currently flat dollar amounts could be more cost-effective if they provided an incentive to select a longer service obligation. The fifth area of consideration is the new military retirement system. Under the new blended retirement system, or BRS, it will be important for the services to ensure that continuation pay for officers is set high enough to sustain officer retention. RAND research predicted that for enlisted personnel, the appropriate continuation pay that sustained retention was found to be the congressionally mandated minimum. But for officers, the analysis found that continuation pay should be substantially higher to sustain retention because the move to BRS is predicted to have a larger effect on the retention of officers than enlisted. Sixth, efficiency of personnel policy might be improved if compensation was used to a larger extent to induce volunteers to take more taxing and critical assignments, locations, and occupations. In the future, more elements of compensation could be based on market mechanisms. And finally, achieving non-traditional careers could also require changes in the military compensation system. Recent personnel reforms have not considered whether following a less traditional career path will also mean a less traditional pay trajectory over a career, and importantly, whether the current pay system can easily accommodate these non-traditional pay trajectories. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ashe. Next, Mr. Todd Harrison, Director of Defense Budget Analysis, Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome.
Thank you. Chairwoman Spear, Ranking Member Kelly, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The Department of Defense, in many ways, is on an unsustainable trajectory. By almost any measure, the size of the force is nearly the smallest it has been since the end of World War II. Total active duty end strength reached a post-World War II low of 1.3 million in 2016. Since the peak of the Cold War, the number of ships in the Navy has been cut in half, the number of aircraft in the Air Force has been reduced by 44%, and the number of soldiers in the Army has fallen by roughly a third. Yet the base defense budget, when adjusted for inflation, is the highest it has been since the end of World War II, higher than the peak of the Reagan buildup in fiscal year 1985. The long-term trend is clear. We are spending more and more for a progressively smaller force. There are many reasons why the budget has been growing while the size of the force has been declining. One of the main reasons and the focus of this subcommittee is the cost of personnel. Over the past 20 years, the average cost per active duty service member grew by 59%, or roughly 3% annually, above inflation. These figures do not include overseas contingency operations funding or other military personnel-related funding outside of the DoD budget, such as veterans benefits and services. If these other costs are included, the growth is substantially higher. In the long term, this level of growth is unsustainable because it means that if the DoD budget is flat and only grows with inflation, the military will be forced to get smaller and smaller over time. Too often over the past 20 years, Congress and DoD have turned to a limited set of compensation options to try to correct for deficiencies in the overall personnel system. When a problem is encountered in recruiting and retention, a typical response is to increase the overall pay scale or add bonuses and special pays for key personnel. And when that proves insufficient, even more compensation is heaped onto the pile. For example, the Air Force has had trouble retaining pilots for several years. To curb the exodus of experienced pilots, the Air Force was offering bonuses of up to $225,000 for a 9-year commitment. But only 55% of eligible pilots elected to take the bonus in 2015. The Air Force increased the bonus in 2017 to up to $455,000 for a 13-year commitment, and the take rate fell even lower to 44%. As this example demonstrates, we are throwing money at problems with diminishing effects. When service members make decisions about whether to join or stay in the military, compensation is just one of many factors involved. A key impediment to reforming the military personnel system is a lack of hard data on how service members value changes in personnel policies beyond just compensation. Too often, decisions are made based on anecdotal evidence or the opinions of experts rather than testing and analysis. We can do better, and our service members deserve better. What matters in the end is not how much something costs to provide, but rather how it is valued by the person who receives it. The way a person values something is a matter of personal preference, and these preferences can and likely will change over the course of one's career. Moreover, the preferences of one generation of service members may be entirely different than those of their current leadership and of the generations that preceded them. Before making changes to compensation and personnel policies, we need to understand how the service members affected will value those changes relative to other factors that could also be adjusted. For example, it is insufficient to simply model how high the pilot bonus should be raised without also considering other alternatives, such as offering these pilots greater stability in duty location, more predictable deployment schedules, or more input into their next assignment. We need to understand these trade-offs and alternatives and the relative value service members place upon them. To help recruiting and retention and to put the military on a more sustainable fiscal trajectory, we need to collect better data from service members on their preferences for changes to compensation and personnel policies. The goal of measuring these preferences is to identify opportunities where DoD can maintain or improve the attractiveness of its compensation package and personnel system in a cost-effective way. More importantly, proposed changes should be tested through surveys and, where possible, through controlled trials on a subset of the overall population before being rolled out to the entire force. While it is only practical to have OSD and the services manage this process of experimentation and data collection, Congress can play an important role by setting the parameters for what changes should be tested, providing the necessary authorities, and holding senior leaders accountable to make sure it gets done. We should not continue to throw money at recruiting and retention problems and hope things will improve, while some of our best and brightest continue to leave the military or never join in the first place. Nor should we make changes to the personnel system without understanding the effects these changes are likely to have on the force. In many areas, we have reached the point of diminishing marginal utility in our compensation system. A new evidence-based approach is required that looks at the full range of options to optimize the military personnel system. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Now we're going to hear from Mr. Peter Levine, who's a senior fellow at the Institute for Defense Analysis. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Kelly. Thank you both for inviting me here today to participate in this hearing. We have an extraordinary military, but building and maintaining the human capital that we need is an ongoing challenge. As the Chairwoman indicated, about 1 in 6 of our young people today meet the academic standards for recruitment and are otherwise eligible to serve. The numbers are even more daunting when you look at the high skills such as technological savvy and computer literacy that are increasingly needed for the future force and for which we are in direct competition with the private sector. Under these circumstances, we need to do everything we can to expand our talent base, not shrink it. That's why our search for talent must draw on every sector of our society. Without women, for example, our force would not only be smaller, it would be significantly less capable. I agree with the ranking member that the basic framework of our upper-out system remains sound. DOTMA continues to play a vital role in providing the stability and predictability that young officers need to plan careers and that personnel chiefs need to plan the future force. It also contributes to the development of our young officers by ensuring that the officer corps is continually refreshed and by providing a highly competitive environment in which it is possible to provide responsibility to developing leaders at an early age. However, we do need new flexibilities to meet new needs. Our acquisition workforce, for example, faces the challenge of trying to acquire cyber, space, software, artificial intelligence, and other new technologies from an industrial base that is no longer dominated by the traditional defense contractors. Despite unprecedented attention to strategic planning requirements, promotion patterns, and career development opportunities over the last decade, we continue to hear about critical gaps in acquisition skills and capabilities. Some of that shortfall is attributable to a risk-averse culture that has become overly dependent on traditional ways of doing business. But I don't think we should overlook the part played by the officer management system. Under the best of circumstances, it takes 10 to 15 years to build a skilled manager with the training and experience needed to guide the acquisition process. For military officers, it takes 5 to 10 years longer because we rightly insist on rotational assignments so that our acquisition professionals will have the muddy boots needed to understand how the military works. The result is that just as acquisition officers develop the specialized skills and experience judgment that we so desperately need, they're pushed out the door into early retirement. A few years ago, Bernie Rosker of RAND wrote that the DOTMA tenure and retirement rules fail to meet the needs of the military intelligence community because they truncate and terminate military careers just when intelligence officers have gained the experience necessary to make them truly productive. He suggested we might need to try 40-year careers in this kind of specialty field. The same prescription may be appropriate for the military acquisition workforce. Fortunately, the DOTMA changes included in last year's NDAA provide a pathway for cautious experimentation with such changes. I urge you to stand by those changes and closely monitor the manner in which they're implemented. We need to change, but we cannot afford to break the existing system as we seek to improve it. Thank you for inviting me to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Levine. Thank you all. I was particularly shocked by the data that Mr. Harrison provided about the Air Force. And it's one thing to know that we kept adding bonuses in an attempt to get the number of pilots to retain the numbers we need for the force, but to see that the numbers actually went down, the bigger the bonuses got, was very disheartening, which underscores what all of you are really saying, that it's more than money. So I'd like to ask each of you to give us your thoughts on how we can recruit the talent that we need without just throwing money at it. Dr. Ashe, would you like to begin?
Yeah, so thank you. So my understanding of the Air Force situation specifically is that actually they have been moving towards a number of non-monetary activities, including more stability, more time flying, and so forth. And we have RAND research. That's not my expertise, but we do have RAND research that we could send the committee that speak to many of these non-monetary activities that have been going on. It's not, as somebody who studies carefully data on things like the effects of bonuses on retention, it's often not surprising that we see when bonuses increase, retention falls. And what that is telling us is the bonus wasn't high enough. And so now that doesn't mean that it has to be in the form of money. There could be non-monetary options. But in fact, what it's saying is that given the growth of civilian demand, we know that civilian demand in the major airlines has increased dramatically as a result of retirements, a retirement boom that's happening in the major airlines. The economy grows, that causes the major airline industry to grow, and also changes in requirement in flying hours. All of that has resulted in an increase in demand for pilots, which is affecting the demand for military pilots. So the competition is particularly fierce. Is it only about money? Of course not, and efforts are being made to not just deal with money, but money also helps. And in fact, bonuses are effective, and there is a question of whether the current cap of $35,000 per year of obligated service is sufficiently high given the nature of the demand and its continued growth in that field.
So the Army didn't meet its goals for recruitment.
That's an enlisted issue, and I can speak to that if you would be interested. So, recruiting is particularly challenging right now because of, as a ranking member Kelly mentioned, I think you mentioned, we have a growing economy, an economy where unemployment rate is particularly low, great civilian job opportunities, and at the same time we have a force that's growing. Those are like almost like the perfect storm, if you will, of difficult recruiting. And so what that means is that we have to work hard at getting recruiting right. It means increased resources, but also doing resources smartly. It's not just about across-the-board pay raises. It could be about recruiting, getting the right recruiting, selecting recruiters correctly, incentivizing recruiters. It can be about more advertising, more intelligent advertising, targeted advertising, managing the recruiting enterprise more smartly, and frankly, even expanding selection criteria so that we can deal with the issue that only that 70% of young people are not eligible to enlist.
Mr. Harrison, your comments on what besides money is going to get us the kinds of talent and recruits that we want?
I think we are continuing to ask the wrong questions here, right? That we shouldn't just be focused on what is the right level of bonus, because if you're facing a retention challenge and you raise the bonus and not that many people take it, then obviously raise it more. At some point, though, you raise the bonus to a level where you cheapen the value of service, and that you do not want to force where people are just choosing to stay because you're giving them so much money. I think that undermines the ethic of service that is a great tradition of our military, and we should be really careful when we start to reach that limit. And I think when we're talking about bonuses that are reaching up to like $500,000 almost, that we should be worried about that. I think there are better ways to look at it. So first of all, I would want to see exit survey data on all the people who elected not to take the bonus, and maybe they're even staying in a few more years because of a service commitment. I would want to do a comprehensive survey to figure out why did these people choose to not take the bonus. Let's ask them all kinds of questions about why, and then let's look at that data so we can get some answers, because we may find, sure, some of the people might say it wasn't enough of a bonus, to compete with a job offer from an airline. Other people might say, actually, it's the deployment cycle, or I've got a kid in high school and I'm going to be due for a PCS move in a few years, and I don't want to have to move my kid out of the high school again. There could be a variety of factors here, and many of them could be under control and maybe non-monetary entirely. Another approach with bonuses is to have more of a bidding system. The problem with a fixed bonus level of so many dollars per year's of commitment is that of the people who take it, some of them were going to stay anyway. So we're just paying money we didn't need to pay. And of the people who don't take it, some of them might not have taken it for any amount that we would have offered, because it's totally non-monetary reasons that they're leaving. A bidding system allows you to let people bid and just say to them, instead of us telling you, here's how much we'll offer for you to stay for a certain amount of time, let them bid on what they think that they are willing to stay for. What amount of bonus would be enough to induce them to want to stay. You can then rank them in order, from smallest to largest, and start awarding that way, and work your way through until you run out of whatever your bonus, allocated amount of money is. We've tried this. I think the Navy has done something like this in other areas, but a dynamic bidding system seems to make a lot more sense to actually target, and get people at the right level, whatever their reservation price is, if that's what we're going to try to do. But again, I think the best thing we could do is to understand why they're turning down the bonus, why they're leaving the service, what are the big issues, and what are the non-monetary things we can start to address to keep service members.
Thank you. Mr. Levine?
Well, first, let me admit up front that a couple of years ago, as acting Undersecretary for PNR, I did support the Air Force proposal to raise the cap on the flying bonus, on the pilot's bonus, to address a crisis that they saw they had then. I believe, though, with you that that's a short-term and sometimes even short-sighted solution, that you need to look at long-term solutions. And to me, let me just say about the bidding system, I understand the bidding system from an economist point of view. I'm troubled by it from a military point of view. I think that one of the main things that we need to do with our compensation system is keep faith with our force. And one of the things that our force is structured around is the idea of equity, and I'm a little bit troubled by the idea that you'd have two pilots doing the exact same job and they'd be paid differently because one of them held out longer than another one. I think that strikes at some of the core values that we have for our military. So what is my non-monetary solution? I think that there's a range of solutions that revolve around showing the people who are serving that you value the service that they're providing, and that can go to the issue we heard about, for example, with PCS moves. If that's a problem, how do you work with people to ensure that they can stay in a single place longer? I think that there's a particular issue with pilots. It's widely said that we have more pilots at desk jobs than we have in flying jobs, and that most pilots want to fly, not to be at desks. And so to have a pilot shortage when you have your pilots who aren't flying, seems to me there's a fundamental structural problem that you need to look at. You can pay greater bonuses, but if you could maybe just take advantage of some of those hours that your existing pilots would like to fly and aren't able to, that might relieve some of the pressure. So looking at what it is that people value. Right now, what you're doing with bonuses is you're trying to fight against things that people don't like about the service they're providing. If instead of fighting against the things that people don't like about the service they're providing, you address those problems themselves, you might have better retention impact.
All right, thank you. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, witnesses, again for being here. I've had the privilege to serve in our military since the mid-'80s. And in the 80s through 2003, we incentivized people to join using college benefits, get your college education. And I saw in 1990 a drove of those folks go out and say, whoa, I didn't know I had to go to combat for signing up. I thought I was just getting a college education. And I saw that again in 2003. Since 2003, that has changed because people understand when you sign up, there is the chance that you're going to deploy. I think you're hitting on some high points with the service versus pay. Pilots join to fly. Not to be a commander or not to be a desk jockey. Different people sign up. As a former attorney, I also understand some people like to try cases. Some people like to sit on the bench and oversee other people's cases. And some people like to do research. And if you're not happy in your job, and if you wind up trying cases but you hate it, you're not going to stay in the business. And I think the military is the same way. We've spoken in the past about improving active and reserve component permeability while increasing benefit parity between the active and reserve components. What needs to be done to achieve this?
So I would say the single greatest thing that we can do is something that I understand, which was something that was going on when I was at PNR, and that I believe is coming close to coming back to the committee soon, which is addressing the duty status reform, so that we can get consistent treatment of reserves when they're on duty, and not have this system we have now where you bump from one category to another, and you have people who are serving in comparable positions with different statuses and different requirements. So I think that's the single biggest thing you can do. I understand it's moving forward. I hope it's moving forward. But to the extent that we're able to experiment with the active duty and develop new career paths, for example, I think we need to look at how the reserves fit into that. The ROTMA, I believe, was enacted about a decade after DOTMA, and that may be appropriate. It may be appropriate here that we experiment first with the active duty, but eventually we're going to need to make sure that we have parity there too to achieve the permeability we want.
Any comment from you two?
I agree with Mr. Levine that duty status reform is definitely very important. I would also, just harking back to the compensation piece, there have been proposals that have been looked at to better integrate the reserve retirement system with the active retirement system. In particular, an area of contention has always been waiting to age 60 to be able to begin claiming benefits versus the active side, where you can immediately get benefits if you reach 20 years of service. There have been proposals, and we've done a lot of research in that area, and that could potentially solve that issue of having greater equity, if you will, without sacrificing some of the force management benefits of the current system.
I should add one thing. To the point of equity, I think we ought to stop and realize we're making an assumption here that equity actually matters to the troops in the way that we're talking about. So before I would want to change the reserve retirement system to try to make it more equitable with the active retirement system in terms of retirement age, let's go out and test that. Let's do some surveys and see if that actually matters to people, if that's a reason that people are leaving, or if they would actually understand how to value this change in the system. We can calculate how much it would cost. But we don't necessarily know how much the troops would value that change. And especially when it comes to deferred benefits, people at different ages and different ranks have very different discount rates and how they value deferred forms of compensation. But also back to the earlier point in terms of equity, if you're like in a bidding system with bonuses, if you're giving some people different levels of bonuses for the same commitment, we actually deal with this already today. Because in many career fields, some people will qualify for a bonus based on their cohort or their, time and grade or whatever, and someone else who's doing the job right next to them may not qualify for that same bonus or may not have elected it. So we have people already serving in similar jobs, some who are getting the bonus and some who are not, and that lack of equity does not appear to be overly disruptive to the force. So I would just challenge this assumption that equity should be a priority when we're setting benefits. I think we ought to look at all of these things and measure them and see what really does matter.
Sir, if I could
Okay,
just
let
add-
me go to the next question because y'all are going back and forth on things that I didn't ask. So let's stay on point, I guess. Congress made a lot of changes to DOTMA in the past year, giving the services even more flexibility. However, I'm not sure that any of these changes will matter if services don't fundamentally change their culture. By that, I mean that services must ensure they are honestly and effectively evaluating officer potential and not writing off officers with non-traditional career patterns. How can the services best implement this cultural change? Again, we have broadening and, assigning skills, and everybody's not set for those. You have logistics officers that are treated the same as an infantry officer, pilots who are treated the same. How do we change that within the system to make sure that we're promoting the right people?
Well, I'll go first, which is changing culture is difficult. And in fact, culture is important, actually, because, when you have a shared culture, it gives allegiance to the organization. It can be a very good thing. But I understand your point. I think that the way to change the culture in this regard is that it has to be organic and it has to come from the services itself. And I think there are signs to indicate that. The Army, for example, has put together a talent management group. The Navy has already moved forward on their Sailor 2025, I think it's called. They see that they have to bring in the cyber. They have to be doing things to meet their mission. And so I think the DOTMA reforms are actually ones that the services will because they see the need for it, that they will use, and then maybe eventually the culture will change. My guess, and it's simply a guess, is that the culture will continue, but it will accommodate more flexible, non-traditional careers. In other words, we'll still have the traditional careers, but there will be an opportunity for these more non-traditional approaches.
And I'm gonna move to the next question because I'm trying to make sure I give other folks time. Mr. Levine, warrant officers have the benefit of prior enlisted experience and years of specialized technical expertise. We've done much to address officer management, not as much to address the warrant officer corps. As we're doing, are we doing all we can to retain the right specialties within the warrant officer corps? Are there any specific policies that need to be changed in order to improve recruiting and retention of this population? We've got them in maintenance and personnel and pilots. Do we need those in cyber? Do we have the right mix, or how can we improve that?
So I think we need to be aware of all the components of the total force that goes to it goes to officer and enlisted, it goes to active and reserve, it goes to military and civilian, it goes to organic and contractor, and it also goes to special categories like warrant officers. And to me, the key to that, it's not necessarily compensation, although I agree you need to study that and make sure your compensation is adequate. The key is making sure you value the service that people are providing. And I think the problem with warrant officers, as much as anything, may be that they get lost in the middle sometimes. We're paying too much attention. We make sure we pay attention to the officer corps because they're central to our effort. We make sure we pay attention to the enlisted because we know that they're the bulk of the force. But sometimes, but are we paying enough attention to the special needs of the warrant officer? I'm not sure we are. It's a similar thing to what we face in the society as a whole, where the middle skills, what are called the middle skills, tend to get lost and aren't valued the way they need to be. And we have good jobs to go begging because people don't want to do something that isn't a valued occupation. So I think the most important thing we could do in that area is to show that we value the occupation, that it's something we can't do without.
And I think we as a society often fail to identify issues or questions before we rush to a solution. And this next question is for you, Mr. Harrison. You mentioned in your written statement that the Defense Department needs to do more to gather and analyze data related to why officers and enlisted service members are leaving the military. I totally agree. What should the department be doing to better understand service members' motivations for leaving and staying in the military? I think the data's there. I think we're just not using it. And please tell me how we can improve that.
I think a lot of the data is there, and it's in databases that are in disparate places and in places that we might not think of as personnel data that's related to recruiting and retention. You know, we know virtually everything about service members, their entire record of service. We know, you know, if their duty assignment, 2 tours ago, was not their preference. We know if they had an unaccompanied tour for 12 months, 20 years ago. We have all of this rich data. We need to mine it and use it to develop predictive analytics. I mean, this is what, corporations have gotten really good at doing in big data analytics. A cell phone company, they're looking every day at your calling patterns and who's calling you and who you're calling, how you're using your phone, and they're using that dynamically to predict whether or not you're likely to leave and go to a different service provider. And if they think you are, they're going to determine whether or not you're worth keeping as a customer. And if they think you are, if you're a high-value customer, meaning profitable, they're going to go after and try to keep you. They're going to give you different offers to try to lure you in. They test all of this all the time. We've got a rich amount of data on our service members, their families, everything about their history. The real challenge, I think, is with all that data is pulling it all together in a usable form. And having a group of analysts who will pore over that data and will look at it without bias, without prejudging, and saying, I think this is going to be the answer, and look at it and say, okay, on an individual level, what can we do better here with these people? What are the people that we're at risk of losing that we really want to keep, and what can we do proactively? I think that's a real change in the way that we do a lot of our analysis. But you're right, a lot of the data is there. Some of the data that's not there, it's a matter of doing more targeted surveys that measure perceived value of things rather than just asking, static questions. There are a lot of things you can do with online surveys now that you couldn't do 20, 30 years ago.
I'm okay. You've answered that. So with that, I'm going to yield back to the chairwoman.
Thank you. Ms. Escobar, you're next.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and many thanks to our panel. Very much appreciate the conversation and the diversity in views. And I want to talk about a different kind of diversity, and that is diversity within the ranks. According to media reports, as recent as last summer, Latino service members continue to be severely underrepresented in the upper military ranks, despite the fact that their rate of military service has increased as their representation in the American population has also increased. But across military services, the unfortunate truth is that diversity decreases as rank increases. So as we're discussing the various types of reforms to our personnel system, I'd like for us to discuss building diversity in those ranks as well and making sure that everyone has opportunity for success and access to success. Recognizing the current disparity and knowing the human tendency of leaders to promote individuals who are similar to themselves and the natural role that networking and mentorship play in professional success, I'd like for each one of the panelists, please, to answer the question of how we go about correcting this disparity, what steps we can take to ensure it in our talent pipeline and leadership pipeline. And Latino service members also tend to end up in combat roles. Is there a disparity in promotions between combat service and support functions like logistics, administration, transport?
It's actually the other way around. The bias in promotion tends to be toward combat roles and toward the combat arms rather than away from it. The I don't have a prescription of how to deal with the problem you've identified other than to just keep working at it and working at it hard. When I was in the department, I know that our senior military officers and our recruiting leaders in particular had their eye on that and were working on it as hard as they could. I can't tell you why the Marine Corps does better with recruiting Latinos, for example, than the other services do. I know that it's the case. I think it's probably cultural, and it probably goes back to what you're saying, that people are comfortable with recruiting people who look like them, but also people are comfortable with going into a service where there are already people who look like them. So in order to break through that, I don't know a solution other than working really hard at it. Sending your recruiters to neighborhoods that they haven't been going to, making sure that you're working as hard as you can to get to that population, and doing what you can when you have people who are valued service members in your ranks to counsel them, to make sure that they know what the best paths are and what the routes are to promotion. It's hard work, and it's going to take place over a period of time. But I don't think we have any choice but to keep working at it.
Thank you.
I would offer one thing that, I do teach part-time on the side, and I've always worried in my grading of students that there could be some sort of implicit bias that gets into it. So what I do is I grade blinded. I remove their names from their exam. So I'm grading the exam not knowing which student's exam it is. You could apply a similar principle to promotion boards and make them blinded, where you remove the name, you remove any reference to gender, race, or whatever. And have them evaluated that way. And actually, consistent with my overall theme here of testing and experimentation, it would be interesting to do parallel promotion boards of the same candidates and have one promotion board blinded and another promotion board unblinded, and see if you do get difference in results.
Well, and to your point, and I definitely want our last panelist to answer the question as well, but to your point about collecting data and surveying individuals, it would also be interesting to get the perspective of those who have not risen to the top of the leadership pipeline about what obstacles they've encountered, about their own thoughts about the process, and whether they think it's been fair, or whether they think that the opportunities have been made available to them at all.
So actually, this is to Member Kelly's point. This is an area where we actually do have a lot of studies and data, but unfortunately, it hasn't been synthesized very well. And so there is a lot of information about promotion, about the choices that that individuals make and how it differs by demographics. And my assessment, from what I know, is that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So, for example, in the area of recruiting, one thing we know is that recruiting's more successful when the recruiter has a similar demographic to the recruit. That's an example. So it's a multi-step process about how the qualification for occupations work. What kind of guidance are people giving? Is it biased? It's multi-pronged, but fortunately there actually is quite a bit of data and information and survey data that I'm aware of available both by studies such as RAND, but also within the Department of Defense. There was the Military Leadership MLDC, Military Leadership Diversity Committee, a few years back. And so there are sources. I think what would be very useful is if somebody could compile that and sort of see where the gaps are.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Mr. Bergman.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you all of you for your testimony and your hard work to this point. And as far as the Marine Corps and the recruiting, it's pretty simple. We look the young men, women in the eye and say, we're recruiting you to go to the fight. We're going to go as a team. We're not going to leave you behind. It's no more complicated than that. Other services do the same thing in their own way, but that's who we are as a culture. Speaking of that, did any of your assumptions and therefore your assessments consider the unique differences between service missions? One quick example. We expect that if 100 young men and women join the Marine Corps today at the end of their first enlistment, they're going to say, it's been fun, been great fun, but I'm out of here, I'm on with life, okay? Other services want to keep those young, in that point, NCOs longer because they got, different kind of skill sets. So were there any of those mission, the mission of the services considered?
So one of the things that I think is a good point in last year's legislation is that most of it is discretionary rather than mandatory. So it leaves it up to the services to determine which of the new authorities that they're going to apply and how they're going to apply them. And I think that is something that allows each of the services to build on its own culture and use an authority where it's appropriate for it. I know there's some of the authorities, for example, that the Navy and the Air Force are planning to use, and the Marine Corps said, yeah, those are useful authorities to have, but I like the way that I operate right now, and I'm not going to use them, and the legislation leaves them the flexibility to do that.
Okay.
I would just add that, and I agree with the point he made, but I would also add that we look at the data. And what the phenomenon you're referring to of different retention profiles by service are eminently obvious in the data. And so when we look, I mean, we see those differences in the data, and then when we do analysis, we incorporate those differences that we see in the data.
Okay. I'd like to go down the ROTMA road for a minute here, because we talked about DOTMA, and ROTMA is, and I think I already know the answer, is ROTMA as good as it really needs to be at this point because of the fact that when we look at retention of different skill sets over the long term, let's say HDLD, high demand, low density assets that are high burnout in the active component, someone decides to leave active service, but whether it's IT, Intel, cyber, civil affairs, whatever it happens to be, is ROTMA as flexible as it needs to be going forward to transition some of those HDLD skill sets into the reserve component so you can maintain the expertise that now that staff sergeant or that major has acquired?
So I think that sometimes the legislation gets blamed for things that aren't the fault of the legislation at own. DOTMA and ROTMA both provide frameworks. They provide a great deal of flexibility within those frameworks, even before last year's legislation, but more so with last year's legislation. I think that we have a lot of the flexibility that we need to address specific needs of specific communities within the armed services, specific skill sets. There are places where we aren't using those, and we need to move slowly on that because we don't want to break the system. And we need to consider which skills are more appropriate in the reserves than the active duty, for example, and build those. But I think that we need to be careful about saying, well, we're not getting everything we need, therefore the legal framework is wrong. I think the legal framework is fundamentally sound, and we need to figure out how to work within that to get the skills.
So to go down that road for a quick second, is the 179-day limitation continuous active duty, then you count against active duty end strength, is that still in place?
I believe so. Yes.
Is it time to get rid of that?
I don't have a view on that.
Well, the point is when you look at force management and you look at the commander's capability to bring on limited assets, we're not talking we're not talking battalions, we're not talking squadrons, we're talking onesie twosies, because the reason people used to ask for 179 days active duty for a reservist was that was all they could get by law, whether they needed them for 30 days or they needed them for 230 days. But as we move forward with, we're here to be part of the solution here. If it means we need to change something in that 179-day limitation, because nobody wants to go over end strength.
So I would say if you're talking about ones and twos, it's probably not something that's going to push you up against end strength, and you may have more of a budget problem than an end strength problem. Do I have the money to pay to bring these folks onto active duty? Have I budgeted it right?
Well, okay, if you're funding it out of, RPMC, pardon me, I'm getting into the acronyms now here, but the point is that, yeah, it is all about funding. I guess I'm over my time. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Luria?
Well, thank you for being here today. And as we've gone through this, we've mentioned that there is data and there's a need to analyze the data more, as well as the fact that, exit data would be useful information for us to be able to help craft these policy decisions. And I'm wondering, from any of the data that is available that you have reviewed, and I'll put my question to Mr. Harrison, where would you say that military pay falls out in the scale of the different things, such as job satisfaction, op tempo, work-life balance, morale, and then a desire basically to have your boss's job and to continue to move up through in the chain of command? where would you say pay falls in all of those? Is that at the top?
So I would first caution that I have not seen data that I'm adequately satisfied with that actually does the trade-offs, that measures the trade-offs that service members make among these very different forms of compensation and personnel system. In a study that I had done about 7 years ago now, we attempted to do this, but we did not have a statistically significant data set. It was not randomly chosen service members. It was whoever decided to take the survey. And so it was more of a proof of concept, but we were trying to get at how you measure the relative value that folks place on different forms of compensation. I do believe that the Military Compensation and Retirement Modernization Commission from several years ago, they did a survey like this. I believe they published the results, but I've not been through that thoroughly enough to know, but I think that's a place to look.
Okay, well, I can take a look at that as well. And I did find a Navy retention study from 2014 that, the list I gave were some of the factors that they put in there. And also just speaking anecdotally from my 20 years of serving as well as an officer, and we're focusing on that, the pay and compensation were good, they were sufficient, and I don't know myself or my peers were ever really looking at that. And Dr. Ashe, I appreciate your analysis in different ways of the breakdown of both time and grade and rank and what those deltas are in the pay structure. But I think that might be something that is helpful, but I don't find that to be the main thing that is going to drive people towards whether they stay or go with the career path. But what I think really is that we're making an investment in people once we bring them in. And we bring them in, there's a specific point they get to in their career. And with the up and out model, if you're in the out group, i.e. you didn't meet that particular career milestone that would then lead to your next promotion, we don't have, I wouldn't even say an off-ramp, but a re-ramp to take the skills that person has developed, whether they be a pilot that may never go to command, but is a really good pilot and wants to continue to fly. Why continue to train a new pilot from scratch? The same thing with a variety of other career fields. So I just wondered if you had, anything to weigh in on that, and, whether you think that type of alternative path system might be an effective way to maintain the talent that we've already invested in.
So I think that is a very good way to try to maintain some of the talent we've invested in. Up or out promotion is great to a point, right? And there should be a way for people to rise to the level of their highest competence and not be pushed further, quite frankly. And if we just have a plain up or out promotion system like we've traditionally had, you keep pushing people to higher and higher levels of competence, and eventually it exceeds their ability, and then they get pushed out. A lot of people know when they've reached that middle point, where they are at their best, they're at their peak, and we should allow them to be able to stay there and stay for a much longer productive career, as long as they're good use to the military and good at what they're doing.
Well, I appreciate that, and I know early on, and Dr. Ashe, you also mentioned, I think in your statement, the refresh of the pool of officers coming in, which is very important, so a balance between the two. But I felt like I often saw peers who met that point of there was no longer an up, and then there was an option for an out, and I saw us, almost like a sine wave, both on the officer and enlisted side, because you're always trying to meet a demand signal, and the time to react to it is always somewhere in the past. So we seem to always have fluctuations where we grow and shrink, but we're never quite at the strength we need at a particular time. So I really appreciate all of your inputs and studies into this, and thank you for being here today. I yield my time.
Mr. Levine, you had, I think, a comment that you'd like to make to Ms. Luria?
I think we need to be very careful about how we depart from up or out. I think that exceptions are fine, but I would hate to see us abandon it completely. I mean, we don't want to get to the point where we have the senior ranks jammed and there's no place for the younger people to move to. And I also think that we have a second problem, which is a great deal of difficulty saying no to people in the military. And so if there's a way to say yes, we'll always say yes. The up or out system is something that that forces a no decision in some circumstances. You're gone. So I don't have to say you're gone because you're inadequate and you don't meet our standards. You're gone just because that's what happens at this stage of a career.
Well,
If you just look at OERs and the ability to say this person isn't performing up to stuff, we don't have that ability strongly built into our culture. And I think that the backstop of the up or out system is something that helps us in that regard.
well, may I respond just?
Certainly can.
Well, I agree completely that we need the main structure of our military system and rank should continue to be essentially an up and out structure. But I think that there's certain points and career milestones. We also talked about, everything was always built to the 20 years. Everybody's, well, I'll get to 10. I've done this for 10. I've invested this time. So my goal is now just to stay for 20 so I can get the retirement. Changing that end goal with a different and blended retirement system may adjust people's decisions at those milestone points. And then, 40 years old is pretty early for somebody to say, I'm now retired from the military, get those benefits and move on to another career. So maybe it's a longevity thing where somewhere between the 10 and 20 or 10 and 15-year point, we can get more out of the investment that we had if the up and out is not so stringently enforced in a 2-promotion board look cycle and it was extended. So I think that up and out is essentially the culture of the military, and that maintains the order and rank structure of the military. But I think that maybe a little bit more flexibility within that, especially when we talk about, people's family planning choices, retaining more women. I mean, we don't have time to get into all of those things, but a lot of those are factors within people's decisions.
I think I agree with absolutely everything you just said. So
All right, thank you.
Great, sorry to take so much time.
We just need flexibility. We need flexibility in the system. We just need to be careful about how we do it.
Ms. Holland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question going back to diversity, and I think you each can answer this question pretty quickly. Studies have shown diversity, including diversity of race, gender identity, religion, and ethnicity, improve retention and reduce the costs associated with employee turnover or personnel turnover. And in your opinion, wouldn't the DoD benefit from diversity in that respect?
Absolutely. You always want to draw from a largest possible pool of people and get the best and brightest of that. So we should absolutely cast the net as wide as we possibly can and try to recruit everyone who we possibly can.
If we want to benefit from the talents that are available in our society, we have to be open to what our society has to offer, and that's an incredible amount of diversity. It's one of our strengths.
Absolutely.
I of course, agree as well. And my sense is that this is an issue that the services are working actively on. Whether it's effective, I don't know, but I think that it's understood that it's important for the reasons my colleagues have mentioned.
Right, yes. And it's seemingly important in our history, right, of having, I'm thinking about the Navajo Code Talkers, for example. If we hadn't recruited Native Americans in large numbers, perhaps we never would have known that they had something like that to offer our military. But I'm concerned about the transgender ban. I'll just be honest with you. I feel like that's not benefiting our military. And so, in your opinion, do you feel that a policy such as that should be eliminated in order to not discriminate and, keep that diversity channel open?
So I'm not going to directly address the transgender ban, but I was at PNR in charge of implementing the former policy of accepting transgenders. And I will tell you that the position we started from was that we have several thousand transgender individuals in the military today, and we have historically. And the question isn't, are you going to have them? It's how are you going to treat them? And so the approach that we took was, given that they're in the military, what is the appropriate way to treat them? And we thought that the appropriate way to treat them was as individuals, to allow them to serve openly, and to provide them the medical care that they needed.
In my own personal opinion, I don't see any reason to ban people from service based on gender or transgender status.
And as a researcher, my natural inclination is what are the costs and how will it affect the force? And my sense is from the research is that this is such a small population with a small cost relative to the overall size of the budget that it might be that it ultimately is not an issue in terms of readiness.
Thank you for that. And so this, I think you can all answer this question also. Other than salary, are there other conditions such as housing conditions or frequent relocations that cause service members to leave? I know there's been an issue recently with military housing, for example, that hasn't actually has been dangerous to families. So what is your opinion on that?
So what I would say is, obviously mold and unlivable conditions is just unacceptable, and it needs to be fixed, clearly. But we have to distinguish between the living conditions and the acceptability of the living conditions and the oversight and making sure that we're giving the right quality housing from the allowance. And it's not clear that the allowance is inadequate, frankly. And in fact, I think we have to make that distinction. The other point I'd like to make is in the area of research and data, in my view, there is inadequate research related to the effect of what I'll call quality of life aspects of military service on retention. There's a recent study that was completed on the MyCAA, the Scholarship for Military Spouses. That was one of the first scientifically valid studies that have been done on that. But, what is the effect of commissaries? What are the effect of housing quality? All of those things we actually don't know. I would like to say one other thing, which is there's been some discussion about looking at exit surveys and people's attitudes towards and values of compensation. Of course, that's useful, including the housing. But I would also say that ultimately it comes down to what's the effect on readiness and what's the most cost-effective way of meeting readiness goals using all the tools available. What I would say is what members say they value. What we find in research is what people say doesn't necessarily affect their behavior in terms of retention. So we need to be very careful, including the quality of the housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield.
Thank you, Mrs. Davis.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here. I appreciate it, and I know that you've been talking a lot about having good data and asking questions, and I wanted to just single out Mr. Harrison for a second because I know we were having this discussion a number of years ago, and one of the conversations, as I recall, is that we often just don't ask. And that if you don't ask, you're not going to get the information. It sounds like maybe there's a little bit more asking, but I'm not sure that it's as focused necessarily as it could be. And Dr. Ashe, and I think Mr. Levine as well, I mean, you started talking about the quality of life issues. And we can't assume that people would select any one quality of life issue over another. But again, I guess, Mr. Are people getting that we have to ask?
I mean, as Dr. Ashe just pointed out, that we actually don't know how a lot of these things, PCS moves and the quality of the housing and things like that, we don't actually have good analysis and data to know how they affect things like retention. And so I think the answer is no. I don't think we're getting it yet, that these things are very important. I mean, just take commissaries, for example. How many times do we debate the value of commissaries over and over? It's $1.3, $1.4 billion a year in the budget, and we don't know how it actually affects service member recruiting and retention. I mean, we need to know that.
Yeah.
These are important questions, so I think we still have a long way to go.
And maybe we just haven't figured out the best way to do that. But getting that input from y'all is good. I wanted to just turn to an area of parental leave, because I think the parental leave policies make a great difference to our service members. We know that certainly from the private sector, and having an equitable parental leave policy across the services has to increase retention, I would think. But perhaps, again, that's something that one has to ask. And the next question is, and again, it's making that connection with people, is What kind of parental leave policy is it that people would like to see? Because we have both primary and secondary caregivers. And I know that I've spoken to a number of people, and we tried introducing this in the past, that it's best if both parents, not necessarily continuously, but at least over a period of time, can be available with a new child. And the same goes for an aging parent that needs some assistance. So what do we know about that? And how would we begin to really ascertain what that looks like?
So these types, this is a great example. Childcare, all these, important benefits. It's not that we don't think people don't think it's important. It's really hard to do an evaluation because they aren't. It's like it's important, but I don't think about it, And so what's needed is a data collection, a controlled experiment. But it takes resources and time. And it's not clear it's something that can be put to the service. I mean, like the services spontaneously will put it together. There needs to be resources to do valid testing of these things because it's very hard to collect data. Somebody who's very familiar with the data that are available on personnel, these data are not available in a way that is amenable to analysis. So we need to collect the data, and we need to do it within a framework of a controlled experiment that will take time and funding. Thank you.
So we did just make the parental leave policies more generous a couple of years ago. I don't know, and maybe Ms. Ashe can do it, but I don't know how we separate out the impact of that from the impact of a lot of other things that have been going on in the military to determine how much of an impact that has on recruitment or retention. The one thing I'd say is I think that there's a piece that's a cultural piece too. One of the things that Congress did last year, which I think is a good thing, is you made the career intermission program permanent, which I think gives potential flexibility to young parents in a way that a leave period of several weeks does not. Because if you could take a couple of years to be with a young child, that might really make a difference. The question is whether it will be acceptable within the military system to actually take advantage of that opportunity, and we won't know that for a while yet. Whether people will actually be able to do that and then be able to have careers afterwards.
Yeah, Mr. Harrison, just quickly, because my time is up.
Sure, I just wanted to reiterate that as Dr. Ashe said, that it's a very excellent point that what people say in a survey does not always translate in how they act in reality. So that's why I think this has to be a multi-phased approach with any potential changes. You first need to ask through surveys, figure out if this looks like it might be a potentially good idea. Then you want to run small-scale randomized controlled trials and actually verify that these results are working in practice. It's not always possible to do that for something macro like the commissaries, but for things like parental leave, you could do trials like this, verify the results happen in reality, and then once you roll it out to the whole force, you need to continually measure and reassess and understand, do we need to change this, do we need to tweak it as time goes by, because the preferences of generations are going to change over time, and the demographics of the service members coming in are going to change over time, and so we have to respond to that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. A couple of quick questions, and then I don't know if we want to do another round or not. I believe we now have 12 weeks for service members for parental leave. Is that correct?
That sounds right, yes.
Which is more than we have for staff of Congress, I believe, and certainly for federal employees. So that's a good positive. One thing we haven't talked about is the number of women coming in to the military and to what extent that should be changing the way we look at these policies. So that's one question. Second question is, the military of yesterday was made up of single people. The military of today is made up of couples. And how should that inform our decision-making in terms of personnel policies? Each of you can just answer those two questions quickly. Start with you, Mr. Levine.
Well, I think that it has to inform our decision-making. the fact that we have more women and we're reliant on women for critical skills and capabilities that we absolutely need is why Secretary Carter wanted to extend the family leave policy. It was the basis for that decision. It was sort of more self-interested than anything else. We need that in order to, his feeling was we need that in order to retain the force that we need. And we do have a more married force. That's why something like career intermission may be a necessary step if we can use it effectively to be able to retain people that we haven't been able to retain in the past. One of the statistics that always interested me about the force is that male officers who are married stay longer. Female officers who are married leave sooner. And why is that? Is because of gender roles in society, presumably, but it's a fact that we have to deal with. We have to understand that pattern exists and figure out how we deal with that so that we can retain female officers without putting them in a position where they feel they can never get married, because if they do, then they're not going to be able to serve.
I would say, to your point, it's not just that we have more couples in the military, more married people in the military. We're having more and more dual professional households, right? We want to attract and retain, the best and the brightest, the hard-charging people. Well, those people also tend to marry people like that themselves. And then we have to look at some of the policies of our career system, like PCS moves. When you're forcing families to pick up and move every couple of years, if the service member's spouse also has a profession of their own, sometimes jobs aren't that portable. If you're a young attorney, getting up and moving to different states every couple of years is going to be very disruptive to your career. And so I think we have to take that into account. And we have to also watch out for a self-selection system, as Mr. Levine was just talking about, that you may have the people who choose to stay may be the people who, this is not a problem for in their family, and the ones who are getting out, it might tend to be those who this does create a bigger burden for them. And so then when you have senior leaders who are making a lot of the decisions within the services about, how often people should move and what the career path should be, they may be a subset of the population that does not reflect the overall population coming into our military, and so we have to be conscious of that.
Academia does a pretty good job of recruiting a particular professor, and typically the spouse is also highly educated, but may not be recruited, but they find a way to help them locate a position either at the institution or somewhere. Do we do that?
I mean, I'm aware there are many programs to help military spouses, but you can only go so far in helping a spouse, attain employment in a new location when you are forcing them to move so often. I don't think there's hardly anything you can do to mitigate that disruption in someone's career. And you're still setting up a situation where the spouse's career, their profession, is taking a back seat to the service members. And that's going to cause a lot of stress in a lot of families and can leave people to self-select out of service.
Is 2 years something we should look at? Should it be 3 or 4?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Why didn't you say that in your comments? Okay, Dr. Ashe.
And so just speaking about women, so focusing on recruiting, at least on the enlisted side, it appears that the issue, it has to do with women having a lower propensity to want to join the military. So the opening up of slots to women hasn't necessarily generated an increase in supply of women of this, it's not, the women are half the population. We didn't see this massive influx. And so there's an issue of why aren't women joining? Why do they have a low propensity and so forth on the recruiting side? On the retention side, especially on the officer, women are more likely to leave, especially at the key point, I think an 03 point. And I think the career intermission and those sorts of programs could be quite helpful in that regard. And I just want to make one point about single versus couples. I agree with the point of PCA's movie and dual income, but let me just make one point just from the evidence. What the evidence shows that military couples It's not that they're more likely, you know, what we see in the data is that military couples are more likely to get married sooner than their civilian counterparts. So it's really an issue of the timing of marriage as opposed to whether they ultimately get married.
Okay. Mr. Kelly? All right. Well, thank you very much for participating today. You were very insightful, and we will look forward to opportunities when we can pick your brains again. This committee stands adjourned.